What is authoritarianism? Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat joins Thom Hartmann to discuss.
So let's take a deep dive into authoritarianism as a form of government and as a form of governance. On the line with us is Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, a historian and cultural critic, a scholar on fascism and authoritarian leaders, and the author of 7 books, including her latest, Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. Both her website and her Twitter handle are her name, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, BENGHIAT.com for her website, and put an ad at the beginning of that for her Twitter handle. Ruth, welcome, Professor Ben-Ghiat, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start with just kind of a definition of terms. I think most people have some understanding of what democracy is and what a kingdom is, for example, like Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy. But between absolute monarchy on the one hand, or even absolute despotism, and democracy on the other hand, being the polar ends, and please correct me if you think those are not the polar ends, there's this weird little hybrid of strongman authoritarian leadership in countries that started out as representative democratic republics. How do we define this? What is this spectrum like? What are these kinds of government that we saw with Mussolini, for example, during World War II?
So authoritarianism, at its most broad, is a system of governance where the executive branch comes to overwhelm and politicize and sometimes suppress the workings of a free judiciary, a free press, courts, and all the other institutions of society. So authoritarian governments in the 20th century, we had, the one-party dictatorships. Today, you have authoritarians who come in through elections, and then they try to manipulate elections to stay there. So today, it's more of a continuum. Sometimes there are democratic institutions left with a little bit of independence. But basically, that's authoritarianism, is when the executive and the person of the leader, you have personality cults often, comes to overwhelm the rest of society. And for strongmen, go ahead.
No, please finish. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to define the strongman leader. It's partly ironic because as we see in the book I wrote and in many things unfolding in our world, sometimes these male leaders who are authoritarians who also use masculinity as a way to present themselves to their people and in their relations with foreign leaders. Think of Putin, who strips his shirt off and, poses as the symbol of strength, right? But this is also ironic because some of them are the most weak and brittle and insecure leaders who are highly destructive.
Well, couldn't you argue that might be what drives them to be strongmen? That they can't, they can't deal with the loss of losing an election. They can't deal with the loss of control. The whole control freak thing usually comes out of a deep-seated sense of insecurity without, asking you to become a psychologist. Isn't that a piece of it?
Yes, and one of the things, so The Strongmen is the first book to put Trump in historical perspective. And I start with Mussolini and Hitler, and there's 3 ages. There's the fascist age, the age of military coups, so I read for years about coups, and then what I call new authoritarians, the people like Putin and Orban and Bolsonaro and Trump. And so, each age works in a different way, but some of the similarities I found were remarkable in personality. So all of them are, they construct these systems of governance, which I call cocoons or inner sanctums, because they can't stand to have any critical feedback. They need flatterers and sycophants around them. So they construct these areas of government. They often have family members like sons-in-law. There's a whole paragraph about the role of sons-in-law. And this is not a good thing for them in the end because it leads them to make bad decisions. And in the end, they're very bad leaders because they're not getting critical, feedback. And this is all because they have these personalities where they have a kind of manic, need to control everything and everyone, and even the version of reality, right? It has to be theirs. So the slogan, Mussolini provided the template for a lot of this, and his slogan was, Mussolini is always right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in Germany, wasn't it ein Volk, ein something, ein Führer? You know, one people, one nation, one Führer, one leader.
And there you had, even with respect to fascist Italy, Nazi Germany kind of perfected this, where it was an even more centralized system of government. There was no king, and Mussolini had the king, and he also had the Pope. A very unusual circumstance to have Vatican City inside another foreign country inside your country. But in Hitler's case, it was so extreme that his will became the law. So the law of the land was equal to the Führer's will. So that's a degree of power and control that was unmatched except in Stalinist Russia at the time.
Well, and in that context, whether you're defining it as fascist or as authoritarian, doesn't Soviet communism fall into that category as well? I mean, isn't that what Stalin was famously paranoid and continuously frightened of everybody. It's one of the reasons he executed so many of his own people.
Yeah, and a lot of the dynamics were also provided by communism, starting with personality cults. Stalin and Mussolini had the two kind of initial personality cults. And in my book, I'm a historian of fascism for many years, and so I chose to focus on mostly right-wing authoritarians and show the lineage from the fascists to Pinochet in Chile and Franco in Spain. But I talk about communists, throughout because there were a lot of interchanges, like Ceausescu in Romania influenced Mobutu in the Congo, and Mobutu was a right-wing authoritarian. So I chose to have this one lineage because otherwise it becomes an encyclopedia. But the left and the right have done many of the same things in their pursuit of authoritarianism. Right,
and in that context, I have always thought of Soviet Russia, certainly post-Lenin Soviet Russia, as an authoritarian state, is essentially a variation on a fascist state, although the old fascist definition of the merger of corporate and state interests that Mussolini was fond of kind of blows that up. Where do the we're just a minute out from a break, by the way. Where do the bully boys in the streets with their beating people up, whether it's the beer halls in Munich in the 30s or in the 20s, actually, late 20s, or whether it's what we saw in Washington D.C. this weekend, where do they fit in this scheme?
Yeah, every authoritarian needs a regular army, the regular armed forces, but they also need various forms of paramilitaries. Mussolini was the first with squadrists, and then he institutionalized them and made them the militia. But when people are trying to gain power, even as we see and consolidate their power, they usually appeal to and energize these kind of loose militia groupings and far-right groups. And this has happened over and over in history. And this is what Trump did from the very beginning. One of my very first op-eds about Trump for CNN was inspired by him retweeting neo-Nazi propaganda.